So I have a little bit of an introduction, so we'll do that. And for those who chime in a few minutes, they could miss that part. It's Rabbi Vaisrub that we don't want you to miss. Welcome to Hebrew Seminary's Summer Spirituality Series, Finding Inspiration from Wisdom of Jewish Spiritual Masters. This series of discussions is designed to explore the inspirational wisdom of great Jewish masters, reflecting on questions we face these days, and there are surely a lot of questions. Our esteemed Hebrew Seminary faculty and alum will provide an opportunity to weave age-old wisdom into our lives now. Since our founding in 1992 in Skokie, Illinois, Hebrew Seminary has been an inclusive, egalitarian community, teaching our students to become rabbis and Jewish educators who serve the hearing impaired and the deaf, as well as all Jewish communities. We offer a scholarly education that empowers, and I do say empowers, our students to become leaders and spiritual guides, as well as providing learning opportunities for our communities, such as we're doing right now. And I want to give a special hello to our founder and president, Rabbi Dr. Douglas Goldhammer, who is listening in tonight. Yay! For those of you who are familiar with the seminary, we thank you for being a part of our community. It means the world to us. And for those of you who are new to Hebrew Seminary joining us tonight, we are thrilled you're here. And while these extraordinary times are causing great havoc in our world, we're grateful to have the opportunity to reach an audience beyond the walls of the Hebrew Seminary. I'm Nancy Rothstein, hello, a member of the board of Hebrew Seminary, and I'll be moderating the first of our series this evening, What Would Maimonides Do During These Times, with Rabbi Daniel Vaisrub. But before I introduce the rabbi, a few Zoom guidelines, which we're all getting used to enrich your experience. First of all, this is a Zoom webinar, so all attendees are muted. Hopefully you can hear us. The chat room at the bottom of your screen is open for your comments and articulations and whatever you want to write. Please put your questions into the Q&A box also at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be monitoring that. I've been given permission from a rabbi to interject if something is timely versus waiting till the end of this for the Q&A.
You bet.
And to ensure all you can hear you, as I said, your mics are muted. And I want to introduce our ASL interpreter, Paula Blumberg, who will be signing this evening. And thank you so much, Paula. So our esteemed faculty member, Rabbi Daniel Vaisrub, holds a BA from the University of Michigan, don't shake your head, an MA from the University of Illinois, and an MBA from McGill University. Interesting combination. He was ordained by Chief Rabbi Israel Meir Lau in 2012. When he's not studying, and he does a lot of that, and teaching Talmud, and he does a lot of that, he actually runs a technology strategy company. Rabbi Vaisrub will be engaging you in illuminations beyond what you would normally hear. I mean, I spent hours with him, and I could spend many more hours, but I don't want to take much more time because I don't want to miss a second of what he's going to say. But if you read the introduction in the invitation, it said, to say that Maimonides was the greatest mind Judaism has ever produced is an understatement. He will tell you why. So I want you to take it away, and when I can or if need to, I will interject. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. So the rule in the Sanhedrin is you always start with the youngest and the least wise of the sages. So I'm honored to be going first. In certain realms, Maimonides needs no introduction. In the realm of Jewish thought, Jewish law, medicine, philosophy, he's a force unto himself. I actually don't want to give a full biography because that would take up the entire half hour and that wouldn't do justice. The man lived what more normal people would think of as 3 lives. What I want to do is show some of that, how that life played out in his works, and in particular, how those works speak to us 800 years later. Because though the technology base, the social base in which we live is dramatically different from the world in which he lived, in some ways it's not so different. Political upheaval, economic upheaval, death and suffering, plague, that was his life. And so what can we learn from what he wrote to make our lives better and to get through this? So let me share my screen and we'll take a look at some of his ideas. Okay, and it's not letting me do a full screen share, but all right. So his major works, any one of which would have gotten him into the pantheon of Jewish greats, starts with the commentary to the Mishnah, where he took all available resources available to him in the 11th century, the Talmuds, the Gaonic literature, the Aggadot, and other works, as we shall see. And he wrote a complete authoritative commentary on the Mishnah. He started this endeavor when he was 23 years old, and he apologized at the end that it took him so long. It took him 10 years to do this at 33. So that's the young Maimonides. Later on, he writes the Book of the Commandments. This was a common thing amongst medieval rabbis to enumerate the 613 commandments. There's a tradition that there are 613 distinct commandments in the Torah, and to list them. And he does so and includes his methodology for how he goes about listing them. Then he writes what most people, well, some people would call his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah, where he does something that had never been attempted before and never attempted since, a complete statement of Jewish law, start to finish, all of it, the written and oral law fused together into a single document. In some ways, his Book of the Commandments is a prologue to Mishneh Torah. 14 volumes written in terse Mishnaic Hebrew, so it was universally readable. Almost all of his other works were written in Judeo-Arabic. And we fortunately live in a generation where we have awesome translations available to us, most of them available for free on Sefaria. So plug there. Then he wrote the Guide of the Perplexed, which is considered in most circles to be the greatest Jewish philosophical work that set in motion all later Jewish philosophies. Professor Mika Goodman of Hartman Institute said, it's not that he transformed Jewish philosophy, he created Jewish philosophy. And then, oh, by the way, along the way, he also wrote several hundred responsa and medical treatises, and we'll get to those and see what wisdom we can cull from that. So that's just the short form of his works. So let's go straight into a text. So this is him writing as a young man. And I'd like to just take a moment and let people read the text. So a couple things, to me at least, stand out as being very Maimonidean and very useful to us in our world. The first is he recognizes that he's not the beginning and the end of truth, that it comes from other sources. And so, though he's, of course, in everything he writes, he brings him to the fore. He is a very strikingly original thinker. but he always claims he's gleaning them from other sources. He reworks them, he weaves them into a new narrative, but he's basing them on somebody else's text. And when talking about the Mishnah, he doesn't just use the classical Jewish sources. He also uses the words of the philosophers, ancient and recent. I love that wording. That you've got the old printed books, and then you've got the new printed books, and they each bring something of value to the party. And then, of course, the statement for which this slide gets its place, as one should accept the truth from whatever source it proceeds. Arguably the most beautiful words ever written in the Arabic language. Asma al-haq min qalawhi. Hear the truth from its voice. In other words, I don't really care where I get it from. It's what's the thing saying. So sometimes the truth comes from the New York Times. Sometimes it comes from the Washington Post. Sometimes it comes from Vox. Sometimes it comes from Fox News. And the metric isn't where it comes from. The measure is it true or not? And that's something you need to think and you need to figure out. And that's one of the things that Maimonides never shies away from, himself personally and for us, that you have to do the heavy lifting. That even as great a thinker as Maimonides can't do the thinking for you. You can't outsource it. When we get to Guide the Perplexed, Mika Goodman, again of Hartman Institute, says that the reason he wrote the book the way he did, cryptically, hidden messages, seemingly out of order, was to force you to have to write your own guide, because you're the one who's perplexed. He can write a guide for himself, but he can't write it for you. You've got to figure it out. And he's just going to help you figure it out. Okay, so that's the first topic. I'm looking at, we're already 13 minutes in and I'm barely getting warm, as I expected. So let's go to the next slide. This one I just love. I won't say it's Maimonides' answer to politics, but it puts how he frames it. And remember, of course, he's working in the court of Salah ad-Din, the new conqueror of Egypt, having overthrown the Ismaili monarchy. A sage is more of an asset to a nation than its king. Because of course, what Maimonides sees, even as a young man, is the purpose of Judaism, or one of its purposes, is to create a civilization where humanity can evolve. We can get to higher levels of existence. And in order to do that, you need to have stable government, you need to have rule of law, you need to have a basic sense of morals and virtue, and you need to have a class of people who can move the technology, move the philosophy forward. In some ways, that's the purpose of having that structure. And he sees that as core to what Judaism is all about. And so, yeah, you need to have the king. You need to have the sage.
Daniel, one quick thing. You said something about moving the technology and the philosophy forward. What was the technology 800 years ago that he would have referenced?
Oh, I mean, just for him personally, for example, he's a physician. So he's working with the received tradition of Greek medicine, which he himself understood the limits of and pushed the limits of. And so in all matters, you know, he would be, I don't have my cell phone in short order, but a device you can hold in your hand, thank you, a device you can hold in your hand where you can get all Jewish literature available on it. You can be in the third world country, sorry, a developing country, and read everything, not just that Maimonides wrote, the entire Talmud, the entire Hebrew Bible on this device for nothing. I mean, we've gone from handwritten manuscripts to Sepharia. It's a stunning thing. So across the board, he would be, a friend of mine did a class on, imagine Maimonides gets off an airplane today, lands in Chicago. What's his response going to be? And so some of his response would be, you've made amazing advances in your technology. You've done amazing things. And you can't figure out how to beat a plague? We knew how to deal with that 800 years ago. You still judge people by the color of their skin? Are you mad? So, it's just, so part of it for Maimonides as well is that human nature doesn't change, at least until the Messianic era, but you try to move it forward. He writes elsewhere that great change happens slowly. And so he's simply trying to move the goalposts a little bit forward and hope that the next generation will move it further forward. But we'll see he had to face lots of issues that prevented him from moving them the way he wanted to. Okay, so this is what he writes at the end of his commentary to the Mishnah, still as a young man. So let's take a moment and read this, please. There's so much on this page. So let's start with the obvious. This is an argument against the cancel culture. This is saying the people who find flaws in me, who critique my ideas, my teachings, they're my friends. They're doing me a favor because he's coming out of a rabbinic tradition where, though people disagree, there's a notion that we're all in it together. We're all trying to find the truth. And so if you find a problem in something I say and correct me, you've done me a tremendous favor. He also does in short form when he talks about agitated by the distresses of our time. Let's just do a short form of that. Being kicked out of your country twice, being forced at the edge of a knife to convert to Islam, then finding refuge in Egypt, only to have your brother, who is your beloved pupil and your primary financial means of livelihood, die at sea, which led him into a 1-year-long depression, which we'll talk about at some length in the second series, please God. Yeah, that's a rough 10 years. And in those 10 years, he wrote one of the greatest books Judaism has written. And so it's an approach to how do you take criticism and how do you criticize people? That if you do it in the right way, it actually creates greater harmony. That we're getting closer to what the truth of the matter is. And in these days of fake news, and I'm not sure what to think, this is a really refreshing way of looking at the world. At least I see it as such. All right, let's go to the next one. So this one I had to throw in because I had to get something out of the Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of the Commandments. And Maimonides was in fact a political leader. He had the title of Najid, of the leader of the Jewish community of Egypt, which his son Rabbeinu Avraham, his successor, inherited, and actually at one point had the title Rais al-Yahud, the head of the Jews, essentially recognized around the world as the head of the Jewish community in exile. And a lot more to be said about Rabbeinu Avraham, but that's a whole nother lecture. And so he's writing about the commandment to capital punishment. And Judaism has a capital punishment. It actually has it for several crimes. And then the rabbis came along and added all kinds of restrictions, particularly on the witnesses, to render it functionally obsolete. And he is answering the question, why would they do that? And here's the answer. It is better and more satisfactory to acquit 1,000 guilty persons than to put a single innocent one to death. Now, this speaks to the value of human life right here. He recognizes that the cost of doing this, of not having a death penalty, is that you are going to not punish 1,000 guilty people. He doesn't shy away from it. He says they're guilty people. They've committed capital offenses. But to preserve the life of the one innocent, instead of putting that person to death unjustly, we're going to pay that price, and that's okay. So in terms of how you do public policy, here's a great example of how you approach that balance. He's not shying away from the downsides to this policy, but he's saying that if you're going to have a Jewish law that reflects your values, and his halacha very much does reflect his values, that the value of human life, a single innocent life, if that's what it takes to protect it, that's what it takes to protect it. All right, on to Mishnah Torah. So here we get into his laws of human dispositions, Hilchot Deot, literally laws of opinions, but human dispositions is actually a really good way of saying it. And the entire section is worth reading on its own because it's Maimonides as psychologist, as actually psychiatrist. And the general principle is he's trying to keep, and as you'll see at the end, he's trying to keep you balanced, with one glaring exception, namely anger, which is to be avoided at all costs. Everything else in your life, ideally, should be balanced. And like the body, when it gets out of balance, that's when illness happens. With your psyche, when you're in balance, you're, as it were, in the groove. And when it's out of balance, bad things happen. So let's, again, take a moment, read the text. So again, I could do half an hour just on this slide. There's so much here. The notion of balance, the notion of not being greedy and wealth and possessions, that what's important to your life and what does it take to get it? Maimonides elsewhere writes that most people risk their lives recklessly to achieve wealth that they don't need. That most of the things you need to keep yourself going don't cost that much, like air, like in his day, food. And so, as he writes in the middle, you should be happy with the little, which is your lot. That happiness doesn't come from possessions. Happiness comes from your response to your life. Don't be cool. Yeah, please.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Say
Don't be quarrelsome. Don't be envious. Don't be desirous. Don't pursue honor. Just live your life. And it's the life of a sage.
And it's so easy to say this, you know, it's forbidden to utter a single word of deception or fraud. Sure it is. One shouldn't be quarrelsome, but you're really angry and you're exhausted. You've been set to your limits. So, you know, it's what would Maimonides say? What would he do? I mean, we're human beings. We're faced during these times, if we were ever faced in our quarantine time, to reflect, surely. But you know, how do you get to this balance? If you had to give 2 tips from him, it's great. It's all great to read this, but okay, how do people do this?
So Maimonides elsewhere posits that if you don't have the ability to control your own actions, then the Torah is superfluous. The Torah can't command you to do something if you're not capable of doing something. Hang on a sec. if you don't have free, in other words, a God who can command you presupposes that you have free will to obey and to disobey. And for most normal people, that's the case. And so nobody said this was easy. And one of the lessons that my takeaway from Maimonides is nobody said that life's easy. It's really hard. But the goal of it and the result of it is you actually get to be a better human being. My response, and this isn't my channeling Maimonides, this is just me, is this whole pandemic and the election cycle combined have revealed the true self of our civilization and ourselves as individuals. So the question is, what type of person do you want to be when you grow up? Who do you want to be? And at least to some degree, that's in your hands.
True.
So, yeah. So that's, you know, Maimonides would say, do it. Nobody said it's easy. There's no easy way to do it. What I will say, and this is one thing that separates him from the Greeks. The Greeks and the Romans, the philosophers, they always spoke about the middle way, the via media. What they weren't able to do was tell you what that is. Maimonides' great innovation is to teach that the middle way is the Torah. That the Torah itself is the path of, you're not an ascetic, you haven't given up food and wine and sexuality and all that. And you're not an Epicurean. You're not all about that. You're the balanced life between the two. And so that the Torah, both with its commandments, its positive commandments and its negative commandments, puts you on the straight and narrow.
Daniel, we have a request from one of our viewers who's deaf and having trouble seeing Paula, and your slides are wonderful, but I'm wondering, because what you're saying about them, is it feasible to read a couple of the things from the slides and discuss it?
Yes, of course.
So that we don't have the slides, we have more of you, a bigger view of, you know, and maybe, you know, if there's one more that you just really want to address for everybody to see it, but you could tell us some of this.
Okay.
If that's not too much of an infringement on your plan.
Not at all. Not at all.
That's great.
Okay, good.
I hope our deaf viewer can follow more now.
Yep, sure. No, thank you. So let me give you a snippet from Guide of the Perplexed, which really works in terms of, one of the questions is, how do you deal with God in this? How do you deal when we're shut out from synagogue life, from Jewish communal life? And there are a lot of people who feel distant, and they're feeling that sense of profound alienation, as if the modern world doesn't give you enough sources for alienation. All right. So here's what he writes. There is no difference whether a person stands at the center of the earth or at the highest point of the ninth sphere, if this were possible. Remember, he has a different cosmology than we have, but it doesn't matter where you're standing. He is no further away from God in the one case or nearer to him in the other. Because of course, God doesn't have a body. God doesn't have a physical existence. Those only approach him, they come close to him, who obtain a knowledge of him, while those who remain ignorant of him recede from him. In other words, for Maimonides, the primary way you worship God, the primary way you connect to God, is part of it's through doing, and a big part of it is through study. You come to understand what God is, and in some ways, even more importantly, what God isn't. And that brings you close to God. And again, there are no shortcuts to that, as Maimonides himself speaks to. Let me do a quick one from a treatise on asthma, which in fact has very little to do with asthma, but it speaks to how physicians today actually do treat patients and how we should look at ourselves and other people. So he writes, a physician does not treat a disease. He rather treats a sick person suffering from a disease. So when you see somebody hurting, when you see somebody suffering, you have to remember that's a person suffering. That's not a disease. That person is never alienated from their personhood. Elsewhere in the treatise, I couldn't find the exact wording of it, but he writes that you have to examine the totality of a patient's life, not just a particular illness, but everything up to and including the color of the walls of their home. So I don't know if Maimonides was doing feng shui 800 years ago,
Yeah.
but tuned onto the idea that you think that the environment around you doesn't affect you. In fact, it affects you profoundly. And so what can you do to make that environment conducive to living a happy, joy-filled life?
In other words, he knew about epigenetics a long time ago.
Yep.
And I think that's really fascinating, that it's almost like he gives you permission to recognize that your environment does impact you.
Profoundly
and how important.
so.
And that you're
Yeah.
never, you're not functioning on your own. You're part, in the same thing with the asthma, you're part of a bigger whole.
That's right. That's right. And that connectedness, to the degree that you can maintain it, that's what makes humans humans. When Aristotle said that people are that the human being is a political animal, he didn't mean that we're Democrats or Republicans. He meant that we lived in a polis. We live in a community. Excuse me. And that, you know, even before, when we were still hunter-gatherers, we work together. This weak human body that can conquer the world and send a man to the moon and back, because we can work together to do amazing things. So yeah, it's recognizing the totality of a person's environment.
So where are we lost? Where'd we go down the wrong road?
How many hours do you have?
Yeah. But I mean, you know, remember, going back to the title that you came up with, what would Maimonides do during these times?
Yeah.
How would he get us on the road, individually, collectively?
So part of it's individual. He writes elsewhere, and again, I don't have the written sources for it. You should always be men of action. You should be doing things. And he lived that. I don't have the copy of his letter to Samail ibn Tibon, who's the guy who wrote he was his primary translator. So Ibn Tibon wanted to come visit Maimonides in Cairo. And he said, it's great you want to come, but here's what my daily schedule looks like. You're not going to have a moment. I don't have a moment to myself. You're not going to derive any benefit from being with me.
Some things don't change.
Some things don't change. Okay. To anybody here who's a healthcare professional, thank you. I mean, it's just, I come from a medical family. I'm the black sheep, you know, but he lived that. He spent most of his days in the court of Saladin fighting disease. And when the plague hit Cairo, he treated his patients, rich, poor, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and he died doing it.
You actually said in our initial discussions about this, when you said it, I just about flipped out. You said Maimonides was a first responder.
Yeah. We had to get that in. We had to get that in here at 35 minutes after the hour. Yeah, he was a first responder. Whether he would have become a physician had his brother David lived, and he wouldn't have needed to go have a day job, and he simply could have pursued a scholarship even more. You know, as scholars go to, you know, mild underachiever. You know, he only transformed Jewish law forever. He only transformed Jewish philosophy forever. Yeah, not bad for 65.
What do you think that if he had had more years that he would have wanted to do?
Oh.
Or what's your
never set
dream?
up a question you don't have an answer to. I don't know. We know
Sort
that
of unfinished business.
unfinished business. We know he planned on writing a commentary to the Aggadic literature of the Talmud and the Midrashot.
What is the Aggadic literature?
So the Jewish literature is divided up roughly into three different forms of text. There's the legal texts, which are the foundation of halakha, the Jewish walking way. The interesting thing, the closest word to halakha in any other language is either Dao in Chinese, or the exact literal same word is Sharia in Arabic. So the legal aspects of how one ought comport oneself as a Jew in the world. Then there's the Aggadic literature, the Midrashim, that are, as it were, the soul of the religion, where they're looking at biblical texts and reading deeply into them. It's an expansive, in some cases, explosive read of Jewish texts and looking for deeper meaning, looking for connections between one text and the other. Today we have a formal term for it. It's called intertextualism. And it's the same idea that one text, by using particular words in a way, is giving a hat tip to another text. The best description I've heard of the Agadah is fanfic. Fan fiction, that God gave us the Torah and we wrote a response to it. So for example, the story of Abraham smashing the idols in his dad's idol shop and then putting putting the bat in the biggest one, and then dad comes home and says, what happened? And Abraham goes, well, Dad, the biggest idol beat up all the other ones. That's why they're all smashed. To which his dad goes, yeah, come on, really? They're idols. They don't breathe. They don't move. They don't beat each other up. To which the punk young monotheist goes, are you hearing what you're saying?
By the way, you still have a third of the parts, but I do want to leave a few minutes for, I don't see any questions.
Okay, I didn't know if we had half an hour, 45.
No,
45
we've got
minutes,
we've got a few more. So if any of you have questions.
Because you tried to come in, I'm like,
yeah,
fine, no problem.
If anybody
and by
has
the way,
questions.
For people who aren't in on this way of teaching informally ad hoc, you go down a rabbit hole because it's interesting. That's called Talmud. That's the way at least I teach at Hebrew Seminary, because everything's interesting. The world is interesting.
Thank you.
So
go to number 3, because nobody typed a question.
Is the mystical literature, which in some ways is an expansion on the midrashic way. It's a mystical midrash of saying that this text that you think is talking about, well, there's the literal of the text, which is usually not what the text means, because the Torah was written for sophisticated thinkers and sophisticated readers to its original audience. So then you have the parabolic meaning of the text. The text as metaphor. And then hidden in that metaphor is secret teachings, is mystical teachings. And that's what Maimonides begins to explore in Guide of the Perplexed. The opening chapters, for example, are all about language, the use of equivocal words that mean more than one thing, to show you how, if you understand the Torah correctly, you're going to pull ideas out of it that are not obvious to somebody who does a superficial read. But Maimonides never does a superficial read. That's why he's Maimonides.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So we have about 5 minutes, and
Okay.
and that's not to say you're not going to stay longer, but I want to sort of respect that people came for 45 minutes.
Sure.
And,
No. I'm sorry. I thought 45 included question period.
But it does.
Mistake.
No, it does. It's just if we want to go. So we'll go back. We have a question from Rabbi Larry Edwards, which I'll read to you in a second. And then I'll do a quick closing. And then if people want to stay, we can do that beyond the 45.
Sure.
So his question is, if Kabbalah is the third form of Jewish literature, what about philosophy, which you say Maimonides started?
I'm now channeling Justin Trudeau, who when asked a question about the American president, took a full 21.5 seconds to formulate his answer. There's a statement in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, Chachamim hizaharu b'divrechem, sages, wise people, be careful with your words. And so he was demonstrating that that idea has spread across the world, at least in some parts of the world, that you should be careful in how you speak. And so I'm trying to channel that. I was at a lecture by Professor Jose Faur. The memory of the righteous is a blessing. He passed away about a month ago. He was, in fact, a Maimonides expert. And he was giving a lecture on Maimonides' theory of the evolution of human beings, both individually and as a collective. And he divides it into 3 stages. The first stage is what he calls the mythic stage, where you tell stories, children's stories, what have you, more advanced stories, but it's storytelling. Then there's a second stage. We can call that the adult stage of rationality, where you understand the world as it is. And you still can treasure the children's stories that you got. In fact, you hopefully reinterpret them, but hopefully you also don't get stuck in them. But you understand the world as it is in the world we live in. And then there's the third phase, which Maimonides says is reserved for a very few individuals and almost never for humanity. And that is the mythical stage, the prophetic stage, where you've pushed rationality as far as it can go. And then you have what he uses, the Aristotelian term, the overflow of the divine intellect into the mind of the human being. Call it prophecy, call it Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, whatever it might be, that inspiration, that aha moment. So that's how he divides up the evolution of the individual and the individual of humanity. So I asked him after this lecture, into which category of literature would Maimonides put Kabbalah? And Professor Faur gave me 2 answers, one of which was, that's an excellent question. I take pride that I got to ask him an excellent question. Come up with a good answer, that's any day of the week, but a good question. And he goes, level 1 at best. I can see in the group several of my students, some of whom are students of astrology. And I know that Hebrew Seminary has taught a class in Jewish astrology, which is why I did not include my slide on Maimonides' view of astrology, because I love my students and I don't want to harm them.
So never, and that was one of Maimonides, do not harm anybody.
That's
so
right.
One quick question before I get to the closing, and then we can stay on. What
Right.
was the name
The closing
of,
was not the closing.
Right, right. So we're Jewish. So the reference to obtaining free access to reading material, you called it, it's with an S?
Sefaria, SEFARIA.org.
Okay.
Sarah Wolkenfeld of Anshe Shalom fame runs it. And
awesome.
they have done it is nothing short of brilliant. And there's HebrewBooks.org has an enormous amount of classical literature in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language and other languages. The volume of good scholarship that's available today is nothing short of staggering.
Yeah, it is.
And so the question now becomes, what do you do with your time?
Well, what we're going to do with our time now.
The most valuable asset you have. That's, my mind would say, that's the biggest asset you have is the time of your day. What do you do with it?
And your health.
Yeah, because that gets you the time.
Right. So in closing, but we're not going anywhere for those of you.
Sure.
Thank you, Rabbi Vaisrub.
Pleasure.
I know we could listen to your insights and learn more about Maimonides for hours, weeks, months. How remarkable that his teachings withstand the centuries and continue to offer us guidance and wisdom, which we must glean with some scholarly study. And on behalf of the Hebrew Seminary, we want to thank each of you for joining us. And for those of you who tune in to this archive later, thank you to you too. We hope you will participate in the 3 more events of our Series 1 Summer Spirituality Series, and they were included in the invitation you received, and we will pester you with more invitations, not only for each of the weeks, but for the whole series, and you can sign up for individual ones or all. We would love to see you for all of them. So you will get more information, so don't worry about that if you lost the first one. And we encourage you to share the invitation with your family, friends, colleagues, Jewish and non-Jewish. This is really important. We are all seekers, but boy, are we seeking today to understand the world we live in, to understand how to reach God, how to find God. It's amazing. God's name did not come up a lot tonight, remarkably, which is unusual for the seminary. Also want to mention that all of these events are recorded and will be signed, and I apologize for any of the signing difficulties anyone had. We will do our best to make that more visual so Paula is seen or our interpreter is seen better in the future. But these are recorded and available for future viewing. If you have any questions, let us know. We certainly want you to visit our website, which is very easy, HebrewSeminary.org. You can see a listing of our questions all about us, and there are courses, a list of our courses which are available to you, to the public at large, and you can audit many of these courses. We also welcome your support. We truly do, because we function as an institution and we rely on the gifts of our generous constituency and beyond, and reaching beyond the walls of just Skokie, Illinois is also a blessing for us. And we want you to know about us. We want other people to know about us. We've been doing this for over 25 years, and that's why I'm engaged and involved. This is an extraordinary institution. And when we have someone like Daniel Vaisrub, Rabbi Vaisrub today, to share this kind of knowledge, to make it current, to ignite our spirituality, which our founder and president, Rabbi Douglas Goldhammer, is a master at doing, bringing Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism along with Talmud and all these things. I say this deep from within my heart. Thank you for being here. We want to have you be with us more. We're all in this together, and the more we can glean from these masters, the better off we'll be in dealing with our world today and in the future. So thank you, everybody. And with that, I invite you to the post party.
Yeah. I didn't speak earlier in praise of Hebrew Seminary, but for me, one of the most remarkable things about it is rational thought, Jewish mysticism. A or B? The answer is yes. It's a Judaism that's, as it were, breathing with both lungs. It may be speaking with one voice, but that voice is a holy, sacred cacophony. And so, yeah, would I guess that there are people at HS who would disagree with me on many things? I sure hope so. It's no fun otherwise. So, yeah.
So Paula, if you're game to continue to sign, Tom, if you have anything to say to me about this, text us, but we're here for a bit. We didn't get to say it earlier, but Daniel, if you had a few takeaways for people, for life in general, I would say for 3 things from Maimonides.
Yeah.
For these times, for life in general, and for connecting with God.
So for these times, and this is me, nobody can speak in the name of Maimonides. I have a tough enough time speaking in my own name. The first order of business is survival. And so Judaism has a life-affirming ethic. As we talked about, that it's more important to save the life of one innocent person than it is that person's life is significant. And the reason that person's life is significant is because that person, like every other person, is created in the divine image. If I can do another thing from Chacham Faur, from Jose Faur, Judaism is great ideas translated into action. So The man who wrote "All men are created equal" raped his own slaves. Think about that kind of disconnect. Whereas in Judaism, the notion human beings are created in the image of God, whatever that means, and there's a whole host of meanings to what that means, the legal conclusion based on that is thou shalt not murder, because that human being is a reflection of divinity. It's almost like a deicide, like you're killing God by killing a human being. So that applies in the abstract, and it applies in the particular. It means don't recklessly endanger your life. You have to live your life, but in the grand scheme of things, particularly with COVID, when you're evaluating what's the risk versus what's the reward, you have to be very cautious and very judicious about that. And that's straight out of Maimonides, that he writes that most people shorten their lives pursuing things that they don't need. So a friend of mine who's an emergency room physician said, death by haircut? Yeah, I don't think so. So I can't see our participants, but to all the women in the room who have, their hair isn't quite as well kempt, isn't perfectly dyed, you're beautiful. And keep doing that. Okay.
To that.
So that's the first order of business, is survival. And by the way, this informed why Maimonides did what he did. He wrote his books because he thought that Judaism was at death's door. He saw, because, things hang in the balance. And at the time, the Jewish community in Babylonia was very much on the decline. Egypt was doing okay. Spain, we talk about the golden age, but the golden age wasn't always so golden. You had communities, you had the community in Yemen, which became highly Maimonidean, to the point they added his name to Kaddish. In your days and in your lives, and in the days of Rabbeinu Moses ben Maimon. That's the degree of influence. To this day, they're still very heavily influenced by Maimonides, both halachically and philosophically. They're the primary community. In fact, that's Maimonidean, more so even than the Egyptian community. And then you had small Jewish communities in southern France, particularly in Marseille and Lunel. And then you had small Jewish communities further north. And as far as he knew, that was it.
Wow.
And so he saw Judaism. That's why he needed to write the Talmud. He needed to take the Talmud and compact it, flatten it, get rid of the arguments, get rid of the footnotes to just tell you what the final answer is. But why would he do that? Why would you, if you have a living, breathing document that's being studied in yeshivot, why would you flatten the argument? And the answer is, he thought it was coming to a close and people needed to know what to do. So he gave you what he thought at least was the final answer as to Jewish law, as to what to do.
To preserve Judaism.
To preserve Judaism, because he thought it was facing extinction.
That's happened a few times.
It's happened a few times, and every time we survive it, it creates an outburst of literary creativity. The first exile that, all right, I'm going to be a shtickle heretic here, brought us what we now call the Hebrew Bible. The destruction of the temple, followed by the Bar Kokhba rebellion, followed by the rise of Christianity, immediately endangered Judaism. That led to the Mishnah. The beginning of the decline of the Jewish communities in Babylonia with the rise of Islam created the text that we now call the Talmud. The expulsion from Spain created the document we now call the Zohar. All right, that's actually not chronologically quite so, but the rumblings of the destruction of the Jewish community of Spain and Portugal created what we now call the Kabbalah. The persecutions in Eastern Europe in the early modern era brought about the advent of Hasidic philosophy, the rise of the Hasidim.
So
All tragedies, the Holocaust has led to an explosion of Jewish literature, of necessity, because that's how we respond to tragedy, is we write.
and then help me out, and I'm going to be naive here, where I want to be.
Hardly.
So where is Maimonides coming with our connection to God? You could spend your whole life reading in your head and studying in your mind.
Yep.
But if we're going to find God, I have a feeling it's somewhere in the heart space, so to speak. And so where is the feeling Maimonides? How is he bringing us to God? You said you have to sit, you have to study, and you have to learn. How's he bringing us to God?
So that's part of it. It's a spirituality of Torah study. That most people, when they're studying Jewish texts of any sort, aren't doing it as spiritual practice. And so for Maimonides, that's actually part of it. My predecessor teaching Talmud at Hebrew Seminary, Rabbi B'nai Lappi, spoke about the spirituality of Talmud study. That you think, I'm going to find God on the pages of the Talmud? And her answer, and in some ways my answer, is, you bet. That's exactly where you're going to find it. In some ways, especially in the Agadic literature, the legal stuff, they're telling you how to behave. The Agadic stuff, they're letting you into their soul. They're telling you what they really think, what they really feel. And sometimes it actually contradicts the halakha. My friend, Professor Barry Wimpheimer of Northwestern, wrote a book on where you have a legal text followed by a midrashic text, where the midrashic text undermines the legal text intentionally, willfully, showing you just, balance. What do you do? And what do you do with it? How do you navigate that? So the search for God, some of it's study. For Maimonides, a big chunk of it is study.
So, go ahead.
What he doesn't think you can get in this world, arguably at all, is because he's a radical monotheist. And that leads to certain conclusions, in particular that God has no physical form whatsoever.
I agree with that.
The idea that you can experience union with God, that's not even a pipe dream. That's not attainable. That's not a goal. The goal, in some ways, it's not monkey see, monkey do obedience. It's connectedness to God through the mitzvot themselves, through doing them, through doing them with your body and with your mind. It's that combination.
So we have another question.
Sure.
It is from Rivka, and it is, what do you think Rambam would have counseled regarding the psychological and spiritual effects of the extreme isolation many are experiencing now? Thank you so much. So tiny.
Oh, that is such a good question.
Oh, God.
So this is going to sound pat, and it's not. But loneliness sometimes is part of being human. We experience that loneliness from other people, physical and emotional loneliness. We experience it with God. Where are you? We're hunting for this dark matter of spirituality that it's there, but you can't see it. How do you love an invisible God? That's crazy right there. And Maimonides lists it as a commandment. It's one of the 613 commandments, to love a God who you can't see, you can't feel, you can't touch. How's that for both solving and creating loneliness? So it creates loneliness because you can't connect, at least not in a way that's tangible, the way you can connect with other human beings. On the other hand, once you recognize that there is a God that God may not be available to you immediately, but once you recognize that there is a God, you're never really alone.
Mm. Well, I think that is a tremendously good place. I hope, Rivka, your question was answered. I see.
I don't know if it's a good answer. It's my answer.
Yeah. Say that once more. Just say your last.
If you once you recognize that there's a God, you're never really alone.
Yep. So keep seeking. You know, I have a wonderful quote, and I don't know the genesis of it, but it says, if you feel God is distant, it isn't God who moved.
So there's a beautiful prayer, and my students are actually shocked when I teach something out of Kabbalah. It's genuinely shocking for them. I'm about to do it, so hopefully the heavens won't open up. There's a prayer that's customarily sung Friday night, Ana B'Choach. It's based on a 72-letter acrostic divine name. And one of the things in this prayer that we ask that God do is that God guard those who are dorshei yichudecha, who inquire, who seek after your unity. In other words, we can't really understand what it means for God to be one, because God isn't one the way I'm one or you're one or anything in the universe is one. We can mouth the words, but the word one doesn't mean the same thing when speaking about God, may God's name be exalted, as it does with anything else. That doesn't stop us from inquiring after it, from thinking hard, from working to understand what it means for that. And it's that quest, that journey, that in some ways becomes its own goal. So,
well, thank you for that. Thank you for your illuminations. This has been, we will have this recording for everybody. You'll get a link to the webinar. It'll be available on the seminary's website as well, including our post-event continuation. As we said, since there wasn't a formal closing, but there was a formal closing.
Are we going to do a post now, or?
No, I don't know. I think it's I think we could go on and on, but I think some of the last things you said about once you recognize that there's a God, you're never alone, and you know what you just had to say now about a quest. I mean, life is a quest. Seeking God is a quest. Study is a quest.
Yep.
But it's really important that we, you know, have that balance that you spoke of, you know, mind and spirit, mind, body, and spirit.
Yep.
And there it is. So thank you for balancing us and giving us illuminations from 800 years ago that can give us something to ponder, even dream about. So thank you. And we'll see you all. Hopefully keep joining us and give us your input. And we are so grateful to you. And there is a contact us on the invitation that you received. So let us know what you're thinking, and thank you again, and bless all of you. Stay well, be well, and let us continue to find blessings amidst the challenges. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel.
Welcome.